Okay, everybody, what we are going to do is resume the demo portion that did not work out in our initial recording of this. So essentially what I'm going to do is start from the presentation slides that we were talking about to give this a little bit more context. So with the introduction to Windows Azure HDinsight, this service makes the Apache Hadoop available as a service in the cloud. You can quickly create HDinsight cluster for processing of big data. One of the things that's really key to this is a kind of a pay-as-you-go. Once you get past the free subscription, you could, by using the Windows Azure storage, you can only pay for the storage and compute capacity that you use. So when you're done, you can simply delete the cluster when you no longer need it without paying any additional charges. So these are some important things to remember, because as long as that HDinsight cluster is running, you're accumulating charges. Even in your free trial is continuing to either deduct from the credit that you get, which is the $200 credit, or the 30-day trial. Whichever threshold you meet first is what is going to cause that to move to the next phase, which would require you to then go ahead and start paying for it. When we also talk about provisioning the HDinsight cluster, there are basically 4 high-level steps that you want to take. And the first one is creating a Windows Azure account subscription. Then once that is done, you enable the HDinsight service on your Windows Azure account. Then you create or configuring a location in the cloud where you can store your data. This is configuring and creating your storage account. And then lastly, you create and provision the HDinsight cluster. This may sound like quite a bit to cover, but it's relatively straightforward, definitely quicker than implementing and doing this, say, on premise. So HDinsight supports multiple Hadoop cluster versions that can be deployed at any time. Each version choice provisions a specific version of Hortonworks Data Platform, HDP as it's commonly referred to, this distribution and a set of components that are contained within that distribution. The component version associated with each HDinsight cluster version are itemized. So one of the questions that comes up quite often, especially with the provisioning of these clusters, is the option that we're going to use is the quick create option. And when you use that, as of November 7th, 2014, the default cluster version used by HDinsight is 3.1, and it is also based on the HDP platform version 2.1.7. So another question that also comes up is, how do I select a version when provisioning an HDinsight cluster? When you're not using the quick create option, you can use PowerShell commandlets or HDinsight.net SDK, and you can choose the version for the HDinsight Hadoop cluster using the version parameter. So a little bit what we want to talk about is an overview of the Hadoop ecosystem on HDinsight. Hadoop is a rapidly expanding technology stack that is the go-to solution for big data analysis. HDinsight is the framework for the Microsoft Azure cloud implementation of Hadoop. Hadoop clusters in HDinsight use versions of the HDP distribution and a set of Hadoop components within that distribution, as we previously mentioned. Apache Hadoop is a software framework for big data management and analysis. Apache Hadoop Core provides reliable data storage with the Hadoop Distributed File System, HDFS, and a simple MapReduce programming model to process and analyze in parallel the data stored in this distributed system. HDF uses replication to address hardware failure issues that arise when deploying such highly distributed systems. And then lastly, for big data to provide actionable intelligence or insight, not only must the right questions be asked and data relevant to the issues be collected, the data must be accessible, cleaned, analyzed, and then presented in a useful way. That's where Hadoop and HDinsight can help you. So some of the Hadoop technologies on HDinsight, there's, next couple of slides we'll talk, we'll cover some of these. But the primary ones that I want to kind of point out that we will actually be looking at in our demo is HDFS, which is, again, the Hadoop Distributed File System. And it is a distributed file system that, with MapReduce and Yarn, is the core of the Hadoop ecosystem. HDFS is the standard file system for Hadoop clusters on HDInsight. Also, we'll be using Hive, which is a lightweight data warehouse layer. It is a data warehouse software built on Hadoop that allows you to query and manage large data sets and distributed storage using a SQL-like language called HiveQL. Hive, like Pig, is an abstraction on top of the MapReduce, and when run, Hive translates queries into a series of MapReduce jobs. Hive is conceptually closer to a relational database management system, say, than Pig, and is therefore appropriate for use when you're using more structured data to analyze. The other one that I just want to highlight here is that we'll be using MapReduce and Yarn, and it is used for distributing processing and resource management. One other quick option that we want to kind of cover here is the topic of what is the typical architecture of HDInsight. So in this architecture, HDInsight is built on top of the HDP Hortonworks data platform. It is 100% compliant with Apache Hadoop. HDInsight is offered in the cloud as Azure HDInsight on Microsoft's Azure cloud. HDInsight is tightly integrated with Azure cloud and various other Microsoft technologies. And HDInsight can be installed on Windows operating system, unlike the majority of the distributions which are based on the Linux operating system. Also, HDInsight works in a master-slave fashion. The master or control node, or also called the head node, controls the overall operation of the cluster. A secondary head node is also included as part of the Azure HDInsight deployments. HDInsight can be configured to store the data either on HDFS within HDInsight cluster nodes or on Azure Blob Storage. The most common approach is to use Azure Storage to store the data and the intermediate results and the output, and not store data on individual nodes. User data and job metadata resides in Windows Azure Storage. It's also called Blob Storage, which is also called WASB, W-A-S-B, and it is an implementation of HDFS on Azure Blob Storage. Individual nodes of the cluster offer MapReduce functionality. The master node reads the job metadata and the user data from the blob storage and uses it to do the processing. The immediate and the final results are stored on the blob storage. So some of the things that I encourage you to try especially is the free trial, which will allow you to start working with the HDInsight and provisioning those types of things. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, the free trial option allows you 30 days or a $200 credit, and that free trial expires when you either meet the 30-day duration or the $200 credit, and the $200 credit is reduced by the usage of the HDInsight cluster. Typically, as I've seen it happen a couple of times, you will end up using the $200 credit prior to using the 30-day free trial. Once you move past the free trial, you go into a pay-as-you-go mode, which is the best way to do this, and it's based on the compute usage within a given month. This the option is available for purchase at the initial setup of the Azure account. The rates charged may vary by geographical regions, so it is recommended to review the rates pertinent to those regions you will be operating the HDInsight environment. There are features that you can enable in a preview mode, but it doesn't provide any of the premium services, for example, HDInsight. Based on my most recent account setup experience, these services have been mostly focused on monitoring of your environment. One thing that I want to briefly show here is the pricing estimator, and as I mentioned, this is based on a monthly usage. And if I come down here, there are several things that you can do. It's, you can do this individually. You can look at all items. The HDInsight falls under the data management category. And if I scroll down a little bit, you can see that this pricing estimator, if I continue to increase this, it shows the number of two head nodes and the number of data nodes that we're going to be configuring. Again, this is based on a monthly basis, and in my case, I'm going to use maybe a single data node. And just based on that usage over a month period, it's going to cost you close to $1,200. That's why the pay-as-you-go option is probably a better option, especially if you're fairly new to this HDinsight. So the demo that we're going to cover creating an Azure storage account. We're going to provision an Hadoop cluster in HDinsight. Then we'll look at running some Hive queries from the portal within HDinsight. When you come into HDinsight or your Windows Azure account and you want to create a storage account, the first thing you're going to see is you're going to see that you have no storage accounts and create one to get started. So an Azure storage account is a secure account that gives you access to services in Azure storage. Your storage account provides a unique namespace for your data, and by default, it is only available to you, the account owner. HDinsight uses Azure Blob Storage for storing data, and it is called WASB or Azure Storage Blob. WASB is Microsoft's implementation of HDFS on Azure Blob Storage. When you provision an HDinsight cluster, you specify an Azure storage account. A specific blob storage container from that account is designated as the default file system, just like in HDFS. The HDinsight cluster is by default provisioned in the same data center as the storage account you specify. In addition to this storage account, you can add additional storage accounts when you custom configure an HDinsight cluster. The additional storage account can either be from the same Azure subscription or different Azure subscriptions. But for simplicity's sake, we're only going to create a default blob container and a default storage account. And in practice, we're just going to use some of the designated files that come with this creation. So in order to do this, we will simply come in and we will click either create storage account, or I have the option of creating new. I'm just going to go ahead and create this way. I'm going to click the new option. And what we are looking at here is that this menu pops up, and we'll see that we want to highlight the data services, the storage, and we want to use the quickly create storage account option. So once that fires up, we are now prompted to enter a couple of pieces of information. And these are what you designate. You name them whatever you would like. So in my case, since I'm using a different account, I'm going to create Triton Storage 1 as my example. And what this does is it goes out and makes sure that that's a unique name within your storage account area. A couple of things I would also encourage you to do is to keep track of this information that you're creating. So in my case, my storage account name will be Triton Storage 1.core.windows.net. That will ultimately be my storage account name. This next option is now picking your location, and again, you should pick. It's encouraged that you pick the location that's possibly closest to you from a geographical standpoint, and you're only going to be provided the options that are currently available to you. So since I'm in the Western US, I'm going to go ahead and check West US. And one of the things also that's important is that when you create a storage, it's going to co-locate it in the same data center that your HDinsight cluster is going to be located in. And right now, the options that you have here are East Asia, Southeast Asia, North Europe, West Europe, East US, West US, North Central US, and South Central US. So once we provide those options, and in this option, I just leave it as the default. And that's what that means is geo-redundant. It means it's going to locate it within that same data center. And once I go through this, I simply click the Create Storage Account. And this is going to go through and now create my storage account. And it takes a few minutes to do this. One of the things we have to do is wait until this status becomes online. we want to, once it comes online, there's a couple other things that are important. There's pieces of information you want to grab. There are the access keys. There are a primary key and a secondary key. These things are important to have, especially when you want to analyze the data in, say, Excel, which we will cover a little bit later on. Once this piece is complete, you now have the storage, you've met the requirement of provisioning a storage account, and then we can go move to creating the HDInsight cluster. Now, once our status comes online, as I mentioned, the most important thing about this step is that you want to go in and grab your access keys. And to do this, you select the storage account that we're working with, and you go down to the bottom here, and it says Manage Access Keys. You're going to grab that. It's going to load these keys for you. A couple of things that I also encourage you to do is, again, just grab this. If you click these little icons to the right of your fields here, it will actually copy that to the clipboard, and you can paste that in, say, Notepad or something like that to keep track of it. I will also grab this one, and I'm also going to grab my secondary. Again, strongly encourage you to keep track of this because you will need this later. And once you're finished with that, that is really all there is to creating the storage account for an HDInsight cluster. So now that we have our storage account created, the next step is to come in and create an HDInsight cluster. If you do not have any of them, you'll have this option. You have no HDInsight clusters, create one to get started. Again, we're going to use the new option. You can create it either way. I just like this option because it's a little bit more intuitive. And what this now does is it props up a similar menu for you. And we basically get there, we say click New, and then we click Data Services. Then we want to click HDInsight, and now we want to create Hadoop. And what we want to do is now create that cluster name, and in this case I am going to use similar naming, and it's going to check to see if I have an HDInsight name already there. Let me add that, and this is the name that I'm going to use. Again, I would definitely make note of this name. So in my case, I am creating a cluster name called Triton Demos HDInsight, and I want to also include that Azure HDInsight.net that's right below that as my name too. I can select a number of nodes. By default, the cluster size is going to be 4 data nodes. So we've quickly entered the cluster name. The cluster size, again, is the number of nodes that you want to deploy. So the default is 4, but the option to use 1 or 2 is also available from the drop-down. So any number of nodes in the quick create options can be created. I'm just going to use 1 for usage purposes. Also, a quick note here is that when you do use the quick create option, that your default username is going to be admin. You want to also make note of that. I know it sounds relatively simple, but you want to make sure that you create, document this. Now, the password you specify here is the password for the admin account. So when you're logging in, we'll show this. So I am going to create my password. Again, make sure you make note of your password. They must match. And I'm making note of my password in my notepad. And this storage account is, because the only one I have available to me is the one I just created in the previous step, is automatically going to pick that storage account that you created in the previous step. Once you choose that storage account, it cannot be changed. If the storage account is removed, the cluster will no longer be available for use, and the HDInsight cluster is co-located in the same data center that the storage account is. Also, so once we have that option, we simply click Create the HDInsight cluster, and this goes through a series of steps and statuses. This roughly will take about 10 to 15 minutes to provision. And then once you provision that, then you can go through the getting started kind of tutorials, and we will cover that in the next steps. So once the HDInsight provisioning completes, you'll see a status of running on your HDInsight cluster. Again, it also tells you what kind of cluster type you have. In our case, we're using a Hadoop cluster. Our current subscription name is our free trial. Our location, our data center location is West US. And again, here's our version. As we mentioned a little bit earlier, by default, when you use the quick create options, it will be version 3.1 for the HDInsight cluster, and it's using the HT version 2.1.7. Also, we mentioned that we were going to run a HiveQL sample, and in this case, to get to that location, at the bottom of our HDInsight cluster, there is an option called Query Console. And once you launch this, it will open a getting started page. This is probably the best place to do this. This is where also it will prompt you for your password. This is prompting you for the admin password account and the password that you set up when provisioning the HDInsight cluster. So you will have to re-enter that here and click login. And what that does is now it's going to open that Query Console, and it's going to allow us a few options here. And across the top, we'll see Getting Started Gallery. You'll see HiveQL or Hive samples. You'll see additional options too. It'll allow you to see the job history. I don't want to save this for that. It'll also allow you to see the job history and also a file browser option here. This also shows you the primary account. In our case, it's this Triton Storage 1 that we created. If I drill into this a little further, it will show me that this is the container. I want to drill into this a little bit more. This is now going to start showing me basically the directory structure that's underneath. So we have our Triton Storage, which is our blob storage, our HDInsight, which is our cluster, and then here's already several samples that we're going to be looking at. Some of the things that I like to kind of show is some of the HDInsight samples that we're going to be looking at, especially in our demos around sensor data and those types of things. I will come back to this a little bit later on. And also something that's not completely intuitive, but if you want to navigate back up, you can come back up to now that location, and then you can come right at the top of your storage location. But as I mentioned, we want to look at a Hive editor, and in this case, it provides this sample query by default, but in my case, I want to do something a little different, and I've already pre-written a query, and what I'm going to do is simply type that query here. It does not allow, unfortunately, as from my experience, it has not allowed like a copy and paste. So I am actually going to type this out, and we'll do this. And I'm going to limit this to 20 records. And terminate that. And you can now give it a query name. In my case, I'm just going to do something kind of simple here. And once I have this all set up and ready to go, if I click submit, what this does is now it's running those map reduce jobs. And once this continues, and it'll take it about a minute to finish, and now it's already saying it's done, and that was actually pretty quick. And now it's going to update this. And what it's doing is now initiating that map reduce job, and it'll take a few minutes for this to actually complete. And as it runs, it's going through and executing this query, and it will create this job ID. It's telling me what date I actually started executing it. I can actually query, cancel this, or if there's additional actions I want to take, but it's now telling me the status is running. Once this completes, it'll say complete, and that's really basically the demo of a HiveQL. As you can see, it's very much like T-SQL standard, and it looks very much like it. There are a few things that are a little bit different, for example, like limit 20, those types of options, but this is an example of executing a HiveQL statement using the Hive editor option in here. And once this is complete, we'll also see this job status information down here, and I can also go to the job history and look at it from here. Now right now it goes through and starts updating the jobs, and now you can see it's now running actually the details and then that HiveQL sample demo query that I executed. These are two things that are running. If I come back to the Hive editor, it will show anything that is in the current status of running, and in this case we ran this, and as this continues to refresh, those options will be available to you. So as I mentioned, there's also the getting started console and getting started gallery. In this demo, we're going to use the sensor data, and one of the things that kind of talk through this a little bit, many personal and commercial devices now contain sensors which collect information from the physical world. For example, most phones have GPS, fitness devices track your steps or how many calories you're burning, thermostats can monitor the temperature of a building. In this demo, you'll learn how HDinsight can be used to process historical data produced by heating and ventilation and air conditioning systems to identify systems that are potentially or not reliably working, so that you can maintain and set the temperatures properly. So one of the key pieces of this information is we want to refine and enrich temperature data from buildings in several countries. We want to analyze the data to determine which buildings have problems maintaining comfortable temperatures. So actual recorded temperatures versus temperatures the thermostat was set to. And we want to kind of look at the reliability of that HVAC systems that are used in those buildings. And we're going to use this Excel actually to visualize this data. So some of the things that you need to understand about doing these simple, some of the prerequisites that you need to use. You will need to have your cluster provision, meaning you're going to have your storage account completed, provisioning completed, and your HDinsight completed. And you'll need Microsoft Excel 2013 installed. And you must have the Hive ODBC driver to import the data from Hive into Excel. Now there is a 32-bit and a 64-bit version available for download, and that will be relative to what your operating system is set to here. And to some cases, this is really easy to determine, but I believe on a Windows system or Windows 8 system, this PC will tell you that kind of information. So if I click that and I have some of that information available to me, let's see here. So on a Windows 8 machine, determine what flavor of operating system you have. If you press the Windows key and you start typing system and click system, this will bring up a basic information about your computer. And in my case, mine is a 64-bit operating system. So that is the version of the Hive ODBC driver that you would need to download. If this said 32-bit, this would also mean that you would need to download the 32-bit version. So that's how you get to it on a Windows 8 machine. I believe on Windows 7 machines, it's simply click on your start button and right-click computer, and it'll take you to a screen similar to this. So in our case, we're going to look at the sensor data options, and this takes us through a series of steps. We've talked about the prerequisites and we've introed it a little bit. Now, looking at the sensor data, this is actually telling us where these files are being located on our Windows Azure storage. So we're locating some of the sensor sample data in the HVAC directory, and then also for the building data, we have this in our building location or directory as well. There is a series of Hive tables that we've got to create. So these Hive QL statements will create basically our HVAC table and our building table. And as you can see, they're very similar to the create statements you might see in SQL Server. So these will create those two tables. Then we're going to create additional Hive queries over the sensor data. Again, this is a series of these Hive QL statements that we're going to basically use to build out several different tables. In this case, we're going to use this as our HVAC temperatures table and then our HVAC building table. The next option here is we're walking through this, and it is a compilation of all these different Hive QL statements that we saw in these previous two samples. And if you click submit here, it will take a few minutes to actually resolve these queries and create the four tables that we're looking at and load the data into those tables. So to start that process, I click submit, and this starts running through these queries and submitting the job, and it's saying done. And this will actually continue to update this area down here. And until this status actually moves to a completed status, those jobs are not complete. So we're continuing to move through that. One of the things that I like to also show here is that it talks about some of the details, and it's showing the different queries that you're running. It's showing its current status of running, and you could refresh from here as well. And it's just showing all this different information. If I download this file, it'll download information basically in a CSV format. But as I come back to this, my next step, this is where I'm at here. It's still running. These are my job details. So some of the business intelligence tools such as Excel, Power Pivot, SQL Server analysis services and reporting services can be used to retrieve, analyze, and report data integrated with HDinsight using either the Power Query add-in or the Microsoft Hive ODBC driver. Microsoft Power Query for Excel is an Excel add-in that enhances a self-service business intelligence experience in Excel by simplifying data discovery and access and collaboration. Power Query for Excel is a downloadable add-in for Microsoft and typically provides regular updates to this add-in. My experience is it's roughly about once a month when they provide this, and there is a 32 and 64-bit option, so that would have to pertain whatever flavor of operating system you have installed on your computer. So Power Query for Excel enhances self-service business intelligence for Excel, as we mentioned, and it provides an intuitive and consistent experience for discovering, combining, and refining data across a wide variety of sources, including relational, structured, and semi-structured, OData, web, Hadoop, Azure Marketplace, plus a bunch more. Power Query also provides you with the ability to search for public data from sources such as Wikipedia. With Power Query, you can share and manage queries as well as search data within your organizations, and users in the enterprise can find these shared queries if it is shared with them to use the underlying data in the queries for their data analysis and reporting. So, a couple of things with Power Query that you can do is, we've talked about connecting data across a wide variety of sources. You can merge and shape data from those sources or match data analysis requirements to prepare it for further analysis. You can also use it for some modeling tools such as Power Pivot and Power View. You can also create custom views over that data. You can also use the JSON parser to create data visualizations over big data in Azure HDinsight. You can perform some data cleaning operations, import data from multiple log files. Again, the list is very long, and if you're not familiar with Power Query for Excel, I would also encourage you to go out and look at some of the capabilities in that. But some of the other more notable Power Query data sources, you can also query Facebook with it, also Twitter, HDFS, as we mentioned, and there's a lot of others, including Oracle, IBM, MySQL, Sybase, Teradata. Those are some of the data sources that are available for Power Query. So Power View is an interactive data exploration, visualization, and presentation tool that encourages more intuitive and ad hoc reporting. Power View is a feature of Microsoft 2013 and of Microsoft SharePoint Server 2010 and 2013 as a part of the SQL Server 2012 Service Pack 1. And it's a reporting services add-in for Microsoft SharePoint Server Enterprise Edition. You can also use Power View to do visualization of Power Pivot data models and SSAS tabular models. Power View doesn't work directly on top of relational data or local Excel data, but Excel 2013 can create a data model on the fly when needed, and we'll see this in the demo. In Excel 2013, every workbook can contain an internal data model that you can modify in Excel, in Power Pivot, and even in a Power View worksheet in Excel. A workbook can contain only one internal data model, and you can base a Power View in a sheet on the data model in the same workbook or on an external data source. So those are some of the tools that we're going to look at within our demo to analyze the HVAC data that we have created within our HDinsight cluster. So as you can see, our HDinsight job that we submitted, the HiveQL queries that we submitted, have completed, and you have to wait for this status to be completed to query it through and bring it into Excel. So our next part of the demo here is we're going to actually use Excel to bring this data in. So as I mentioned, we used that completed status, and now we're going to use the Microsoft Hive ODBC driver to import data from Hive into Excel 2013. Again, you must have that driver installed, and we're going to step through this. So if I go to the Data tab and I look at from other sources, what I'm going to use here, and as you can see, there's a number of sources that we're going to use, but in our demo here, we're going to use from Microsoft Query option. Now this launches this window here, and it allows you to choose an available data source. If you did not have the Hive ODBC connector installed, you would not see this option right here, but I did this prior to the demo, so I have this available to me. So I will go ahead and select the sample Hive, Microsoft Hive, and select OK. And now what this does now is bring up a dialog box, and there are a couple of things that we have to pay attention to here, and then there are some fields that are not necessarily needed. But as I encouraged you before, how we were looking at creating our storage account and then also creating our HDinsight cluster, and I encourage you to document those names. In my case, I documented that. And what I want to do here is there's three fields that I'm primarily going to focus on. It's the host field, the username field, and the password field. So for my host, and what that essentially is the host is my HDinsight cluster name. So here I'm going to make sure that I put the correct one in. And let me highlight all that, delete. That is my HDinsight cluster that I created previously. The port number stays as the default value. These values stay default. The other field that we're interested in is the admin, and this is because we use that quick create option. It's by default going to be admin. we want to include the password that we set up in association with that admin account. So I'm also going to enter that here. All of the other options are pretty much as is and left alone. So here, if I click test, and this takes a few minutes to actually go out and create the connection to my HDinsight cluster, see if I've got Hive going on. It's running basically a test in behind the scenes to test the connectivity. Once this comes up, it brings up a dialog box. It'll say, hey, the test completed successfully, and you can answer OK. And then once we move past that step, we will start using the query wizard to select some of those tables. So here's our dialog box. It says everything's looking good. I would always encourage to do that test, especially first, because you may mistype something like this. I've had that happen. So once I do that, I'll say OK. And now it's going connecting to that data source, and we're going out to Hive or Hive source on our HDinsight, and we're going to bring in some of the tables that we created a little earlier. And in this case, I want to use my HVAC table, and once I can highlight that and bring over all of them, or I could individually do this. For now, I'm just going to bring over everything, and it's going to bring over all the columns that were created in that HiveQL job that we submitted, that MapReduce job. So now that I've selected that and I want to move everything over, I want to click next. And this is just several steps. Just click through the next options. You do have the option to sort by, but in this case, we're not going to sort by anything. And we want to return the data to Microsoft Excel. So in order to do that, I click Finish. Now it's running that Hive statement out there, going out and selecting all those columns from that HVAC table that we selected. And when the import data basically finishes, you click OK, and after the query completes, the data will be displayed in Excel. It will be displayed in here. I believe it gives you an option where you want to set it. We'll probably set it right in cell A1 for this option, and it'll be in a table format. If you're familiar with kind of the table format in Excel, the alternating row colors, that type of thing is what will be rendered back. Okay, it's saying, hey, our data is ready to be returned. We can select the location we want to return it in. We'll say OK, and now it's going to pull that data down. And what we're pulling down is roughly about 8,000 records, and it goes through a series of executing that query. And once the query is getting ready to return the data in your spreadsheet, you'll start seeing kind of a prompt in the upper right-hand corner of your spreadsheet saying, hey, it's returning the results. And generally speaking, this does take a few minutes to do. So you kind of have to be patient with it to get the data in. But once we get this data in, we'll start using some of the visualization tools within Excel to return this data. So now we've just returned our data. So our next step, once we have this data in Excel, we're going to use some of the visualization tools. And in our case, I want to use PowerView. And PowerView, the add-in is under the Insert menu in Excel. And there are cases where PowerView may or may not be available to you. If you ever come in here and you see that PowerView is not available to you, this is one quick thing that we want to make sure that I point out, is that you would want to go to your add-ins. Then at the bottom of this screen here, you want to make sure that you select your COM add-ins and you say go. And these will show the current add-ins that are available to you or active. And in this case, we've got PowerMap, we've got Power Query, and we also see Power Pivot. And I believe we should be able to see some of the other ones. Here is Power View as well. So those options are available to you. If you came in here and you did not see Power View, it's probably because this is unchecked. If you simply uncheck it and say OK, it should appear for you. So now that we're here, I want to now visualize this data, and I want to visually explore the data. So now I'm going to create a Power View worksheet, and we are going to include some of that data that just came over from our Hive QL. And it's by default going to give you this name, and it gives it a second. And some of the columns will already by default be selected, but in our case, some of the columns we're going to uncheck a few, and we're only right now interested in a couple here. So I'm going to uncheck these. I am interested in my country, and I'm also interested in my extreme temp. So I have now selected my country and extreme temp column. I have cleared the other check boxes. Also on the extreme temp option, we want to include this. It's not here. We can say add this table as a count. That's not really where you want to go. I believe here is really where you want to do. You want to count, and it's going to count all the non-blank options. So now we've basically got some of the options that we have here. I also want to not include my actual temp. So now I've got the count of extreme temperatures by country here. And how I got there was make sure that I say count, not blank. And now it's giving me this option here. It's just giving me the table option in Power View. So on the Design tab, how I want to visualize this data a little bit more, I want to say Map. And then what this is going to do is now convert this to a map for me. And we're now seeing basically the extreme temperatures across a geographic distribution of all of the extreme temp cases. In this case, it's where the temperature varies, 5 degrees higher or lower than the ideal temperature. So the larger the circle, the more instances of an extreme temperature were recorded at a given location. So some of the things that we're now going to move is to filter this data a little bit further so we can see the size. The recorded temperature was hotter or colder than the target temperatures. We're going to look at some of the other things. So in this power field area here, I'm going to use this option, and I'm going to select the Add as Size. So we've got that. And now these different sizes are now indicated by the different options. So in Power View, I want to make sure I've got that extreme temp option selected. I want to now include that temperature range option. And now I get this hot, cold, and normal distribution. And I've also got the temp range is add as size, so I want to make sure that I do the temp range add as size option. And we've now completed those steps. And next, I want to drag that temperature range option also into my filters. So now this will allow me to filter, say, on cold, hot, or a normal distribution. And I can select all of them, and it'll have that. But you can now analyze the saying where I'm under temperature, over temperature, and this gives me the instances where I was 5 degrees or more hotter than the actual temperature. So while visualizing the temperature data on the map allows you to more easily see the sites that have a problem maintaining the target temperature, it does not give you insight into the underlying cause of why this might be happening. So we're going to now perform some additional steps to get to information that determine if the HVAC system may be the source of the problem. And then we'll basically go back through the same steps that we did a little earlier from importing the data from Hive. And to simply do that, we are going to come in here, create a new sheet, come back to our data sources from other sources. Again, we're going to use that Microsoft query using that sample Microsoft Hive DSN connection, ODBC connector. We'll say OK. We do have to provide the same information again. So I'm going to quickly do that for us. and I've already tested, so I'm going to go OK now. And again, it'll come back with that prompt. And what we're going to do is use that HVAC table or building table to only bring in a couple of columns to return in the query. And when we get that back, it's going to allow us to select those two columns that we're interested in. In this case, I'm going to be using the extreme temp and the HVAC product. And we will use those two columns to now further visualize the data in PowerView to understand possibly what HVAC system is contributing to the problem, and we'll be able to quickly analyze that. So here I've got my HVAC building option, and the query or the columns that I'm interested in here again are the extreme temp. So we want to make sure that we go in and select our extreme temp, and we also want the HVAC product. I'm going to add that. I'm going to say next, 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 and finish, and it'll return it to Excel. Again, it's going to give us that table option. And we will be able to, once this is in, we will use PowerView to create another visualization over this, very similar to the way we did in previous steps. And we'll look at a different chart option using PowerView to create a column chart to look at the various variances of the HVAC product and which HVAC product may be our contributing problem. So we now have been prompted to bring our data in. We're going to use the default. Now it's executing that query. You can see this down here as the status. It's executing. Once it's getting ready again to return that data, it will say, hey, returning the data up here in this upper right-hand corner of your worksheet. And it returns approximately 8,000 records. We are limiting it to just now 2 columns here. And it does take a few minutes to get that to resolve. But once it comes back, we will get to the bottom of why or what HVAC product potentially be causing or contributing to our temperature variances within those buildings. So now we're getting that to return. So now I'm coming back to my Insert tab, and I'm going to make sure that I'm going to use PowerView to visualize this data. And I'm just going to use a new worksheet or a PowerView sheet, and it's going to create this. So now that we've got these options in place, one of the things that we want to do with our extreme count is we just want to count, not blink. So now we've got basically our HVAC products and the counts of extreme temps, and we've set that option. Now what we want to do is now on our Design tab, we want to select a column chart option, and we want to use the stack column. And let me expand this out a little bit more. And now that we've got this visualization, we want to now sort by the HVAC product. And how you do that is we want to actually do this either descending, or I actually want to do this by the count of extreme temp. So I want to also do this ascending. So I can tell you that my FN39TG product is the one that's causing the most temperature variances across all the HVAC products. So really in summary, we've basically successfully executed HDinsight Hive job to analyze building HVAC sensor data, and this is just kind of walking through a basic scenario such as analyzing web logs or sensor data. And this is a good way to get started with HDinsight to analyze such data. I would encourage you to kind of go through these demos and learn how to work through these samples, and to also learn how you could potentially apply it to your situation. Thank you for attending, and best of luck.